By mid-1944, the tide of the Pacific War had turned decisively against Japan. The Emperor's forces, once seemingly invincible, were being systematically pushed back across 1,000 islands, each one a bloody testament to American industrial might. Yet, in Tokyo, a desperate and chilling plan began to take shape. Ketsu-Go, the final decisive defense of the Japanese homeland. This wasn't just a military strategy, it was a societal transformation. The entire nation was to become a fortress, every man, woman, and child a soldier. But the grim reality was that Japan's factories, ravaged by relentless Allied bombing, could no longer produce modern weaponry in sufficient quantities. Steel, rubber, and oil were luxuries of a bygone era. The military leaders knew they could not arm every citizen with a rifle, let alone a tank or an anti-tank gun. And so, in an act of profound desperation, they turned to the most ancient and abundant resource available: bamboo. This was the dawn of the Bamboo Blitz, a plan to confront the might of American armor and firepower with sharpened sticks, a symbol of a nation pushed to the absolute brink, ready to embrace total annihilation rather than surrender. It was a strategy born not of strength, but of a terrifying, unyielding will to die for the Emperor. The looming invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall by the Allies, promised to be the bloodiest chapter of the entire war. Allied planners estimated millions of casualties on both sides, preparing for a fight unlike any seen before. From the skies, the American B-29 superfortresses were already delivering a foretaste of the horror. Firebombing raids turned wooden cities into infernos, incinerating vast urban areas and their civilian populations. Factories lay in ruins, harbors were choked with sunken ships, and the once proud Japanese military was fragmented and starved of resources. Yet, with every bomb that fell, the Japanese resolve hardened. Propaganda hammered home the message: the Americans were devils, invaders who would rape and pillage. Surrender was not an option. Gyokusai, death with honor, was the only path. The military, under the fanatical leadership of men like General Anami, pushed for every available resource to be channeled into defense. While the Americans refined their invasion tactics, preparing for amphibious assaults with modern tanks and overwhelming artillery, the Japanese prepared for a different kind of war, one where human flesh and spirit would be pitted against steel and fire, armed with the most primitive of weapons. The stage was set for a confrontation between two vastly different understandings of warfare and sacrifice. The People's Volunteer Combat Force was the official name for this desperate levy. Millions of Japanese citizens, from teenagers to the elderly, were conscripted into this last-ditch defense. They were given rudimentary training, often just a few hours a day, in basic close-quarters combat. The core weapon was the Takeyari, a sharpened bamboo spear, typically 6 to 8 feet long. For those without even that, there were kitchen knives, farm tools, or even bare hands. Women, often forced into labor in factories or fields, were also trained, armed with whatever they could find, instilled with the spirit of Bushido, the warrior's code. This was not a modern army by any stretch of the imagination. They lacked uniforms, proper footwear, and sufficient food, let alone ammunition. Yet their instructors, often veterans from suicidal Pacific Island battles, taught them to charge tanks with explosives strapped to their bodies, to engage in hand-to-hand combat against heavily armed soldiers, and to die without hesitation. It was a terrifying testament to a totalitarian state's ability to mobilize its entire population for self-immolation, transforming a nation of civilians into a disposable shield for the emperor and the homeland.
Against the steel beasts of the American invasion, Sherman tanks, flamethrower tanks, and armored personnel carriers, the Japanese had almost no conventional anti-tank weaponry. Their solution was horrific: lunge mines and suicide squads. These were dedicated units, often comprising young boys or desperate civilians, whose sole mission was to destroy enemy tanks at the cost of their own lives. A lunge mine was a crude explosive charge attached to a long wooden pole designed to be thrust against the thin underbelly of a tank. The volunteer would have to run directly into the path of the tank, often through intense machine gun fire, knowing that their death was a certainty. Other tactics included tank hunters, armed with satchel charges, who would sneak under tanks at night, or groups of men who would throw themselves under the tracks to disable them. The training was brutal and realistic, often using mock-up tanks to simulate the terrifying roar and speed of an approaching armored vehicle. This wasn't about strategic advantage, it was about inflicting maximum psychological damage and making the cost of invasion so astronomically high that the Allies would reconsider their attack. The Bamboo Blitz was not just about spears, it was about turning human bodies into weapons of terror.
To galvanize the entire population for this suicidal defense, the Japanese propaganda machine worked tirelessly, painting a vivid and terrifying picture of an American invasion. Posters depicted American soldiers as bloodthirsty demons, rapists, and murderers who would defile Japanese women and enslave their children. The message was clear: there was no mercy, no surrender, only an honorable death. Children were taught in schools that it was their duty to die for the emperor, and women were instructed on how to attack enemy soldiers with kitchen knives or even their fingernails. Radio broadcasts and newspapers repeated the mantra of 100 million die as one, a chilling call for national suicide. This wasn't just rhetoric, it was a deeply ingrained cultural belief in Bushido, combined with decades of militaristic indoctrination. The government carefully controlled all information, hiding the true extent of Japan's defeats and painting the Allied advance as a series of temporary setbacks. The Bamboo Blitz was thus not just a military strategy, but a total mobilization of the national psyche, conditioning every individual to believe that their ultimate purpose was to die defending the homeland, no matter the weapon in their hand. The sacrifice was presented as the highest honor, transforming an entire nation into a collective weapon of absolute fanatical resistance. Perhaps the most tragic element of the Ketsu-Go plan was its effect on the youngest generation. In schools across the Japanese islands, classrooms were transformed into training grounds for death. Geography and mathematics were replaced by lessons in close-quarters survival. These children, who should have been playing, were instead taught how to find the weak points in American uniforms and armor. They were given bamboo spears specifically sized for their smaller frames and taught to aim for the groin or the throat. The propaganda told them they were little samurais and that their small size was an advantage because they could hide in drainage pipes or tall grass to ambush advancing American patrols. The indoctrination was absolute. They were told that to die for the emperor was to become a god, and that their short lives would be immortalized in the history of a defiant Japan. For these children, the Bamboo Blitz wasn't a choice, it was their entire reality. They were being prepared not to grow up, but to be the first wave of human landmines in a war they couldn't possibly understand. The image of a child with a sharpened stick standing before a 30-ton Sherman tank remains one of the most haunting symbols of the desperation that gripped the Japanese Empire in its final months. Among the primitive weapons developed for the civilian defense, the lunge mine was the most terrifyingly literal. It was, in every sense, a suicide weapon. It consisted of a conical-shaped charge explosive containing about 3 kilograms of TNT, mounted on a 5-foot bamboo pole. At the front of the charge were 3 large steel legs or nails. The tactic was simple. The operator would pull a pin, charge at an enemy tank, and thrust the mine against the armor. The nails ensured the correct standoff distance for the shaped charge to penetrate the steel. However, there was no protection for the operator. The explosion that destroyed the tank, or merely scratched it, would instantly incinerate the person holding the pole. This was the bamboo Blitz at its most mechanical and heartless. It turned a human being into a delivery system for a single explosive shell. Thousands of these mines were produced in makeshift workshops and distributed to local volunteer corps. The training manuals emphasized that the user should feel joy at the moment of impact as they were fulfilling their destiny. This weapon represented the total collapse of military ethics. When a nation can no longer build a tank, it builds a spear that kills its own soldier just to slow the enemy down by a few seconds. To aid the untrained civilian population, the Japanese Ministry of War published millions of pamphlets entitled The Three-Step Manual for Killing the American Devil. These guides were distributed to every household, intended to be studied by mothers and grandfathers. The manual was horrifyingly practical. It instructed civilians on how to lure American soldiers into houses with promises of water or food, only to strike them from behind with a sharpened bamboo pole. It taught how to use household items, shovels, hammers, and even boiling water as weapons of war. One section specifically detailed how a group of women could overwhelm a single American sentry by swarming him and using their Takeyari spears to find the gaps in his helmet and gear. The goal was total attrition. The Japanese high command knew these tactics wouldn't win the war, but they believed that if every American soldier had to kill 10 civilians just to clear a single street, the American public would lose the will to continue the fight. This manual transformed every civilian home into a combat zone, effectively stripping the population of their non-combatant status and inviting the very destruction they were trying to prevent. It was a manual for national suicide, written in the language of a desperate, cornered animal. The terrain of Japan, mountainous, rugged, and filled with natural caves, was central to the bamboo Blitz strategy. The plan was to let the Americans land, let them take the beaches at a massive cost, and then drag them into a never-ending guerrilla war in the interior. Thousands of caves were enlarged and stocked with supplies, many containing nothing more than crates of bamboo spears and bags of rice. These were to be the nests of resistance. The idea was that even if the cities fell and the government was destroyed, the Japanese people would fight from the shadows for decades. This War of the Thousand Cuts was designed to turn the Japanese islands into a version of hell that no army could ever truly pacify. Civilians were told to memorize the paths in their local mountains and to prepare spider holes, camouflaged pits from which they could leap out and stab passing soldiers with their spears. It was a primitive, brutal vision of the future where modern civilization would be stripped away, leaving only a landscape of ghosts and sharpened sticks. The American planners, aware of these preparations, feared that the invasion would turn into a Pacific Vietnam long before that term ever existed, a conflict where the enemy was everyone and everywhere. By the summer of 1945, Japan was in the grip of a collective psychosis. The Ketsu-Go strategy had moved beyond military planning and into the realm of a national cult. The constant fear of invasion, combined with starvation and the relentless firebombing, had pushed the population into a state of hysterical determination. There was no talk of peace in the streets, only talk of the honorable death. Foreign observers and the few remaining diplomats in Tokyo described a nation that seemed to be preparing for its own funeral with a strange, dark joy. People would gather in parks to practice spear thrusts with a rhythmic, trance-like intensity. This was the bamboo Blitz in its final form, a psychological armor that protected the people from the reality of their defeat. They truly believed that their spirit, channeled through a simple bamboo pole, could overcome the atomic age. This mass delusion was the ultimate success of the Japanese propaganda machine. It had convinced a modern industrial nation that its salvation lay in returning to the Stone Age. As the American fleet gathered on the horizon, the bamboo Blitz was ready. not to win, but to ensure that when Japan fell, it would pull the entire world into the abyss with it. At the heart of Operation Ketsu-Go lay a mobilization the likes of which history had never seen. Japanese women, traditionally raised as the guardians of the home, were transformed overnight into Amazons of despair. Millions of them underwent rigorous training with the Takeyari bamboo spears. Instructors told them that the spear was not just a tool, but an extension of their national honor. They were given chilling instructions. If an American enters your home, do not cry. Aim for the abdomen. Twist the spear once it penetrates the flesh. Propaganda celebrated mothers who practiced stabbing motions on straw bales while their infants were strapped to their backs. This radical societal transformation had a dual purpose. First, it was military, to create millions of new targets to slow the Allied advance. Second, it was psychological, to force every American soldier to see a potential killer in every woman. The Japanese High Command knew that American morale would shatter if soldiers were forced to engage in the mass killing of civilians. The women of Japan were being sacrificed on the altar of national suicide, prepared to be a final line of defense that sought no survival, only a shared death with the invader. The American plan for the invasion of Kyushu, codenamed Operation Olympic, envisioned the use of the greatest concentrated firepower in human history. Generals MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz planned to level the coastline with thousands of tons of steel and fire before a single boot touched the sand. But what the Japanese planners had prepared on the other side was a wall of flesh. While the Americans counted their tanks and aircraft carriers, the Japanese counted their human resources. The Ketsu-Go plan intended to halt the invasion on the very beaches through waves of suicidal civilian attacks. Japan did not plan to win in the traditional sense. They planned to make the price of victory unacceptable to the American public. They calculated that after U.S. troops survived the hell of kamikazes at sea, they would land on a shore where tens of thousands of civilians armed with bamboo sticks awaited them. It was a clash between the industrial age and a fanatical medieval mindset. Every meter of Japanese soil was to be paid for in American blood, and the bamboo spear became the symbol of that terrifying currency. American intelligence officers began to realize that this would not be a battle for territory, but a slaughter of epic proportions, where no one truly wins. As the invasion drew closer, Japanese desperation took even darker forms. Evidence and orders suggest that some civilian defense units were instructed to dip the tips of their bamboo spears into toxic substances or biological waste. The idea was simple and brutal. Even if the spear thrust itself wasn't immediately fatal, infection or poison would ensure the death of the American soldier a few days later. Japan's notorious Unit 731, which specialized in biological warfare, researched ways to use primitive weapons to spread disease. Imagine the psychological pressure on the invading forces, knowing that even a minor scratch from a simple wooden stick could mean a slow, agonizing death from tetanus, gangrene, or something worse. Bamboo, being naturally hollow, was the ideal vessel for holding impurities. This was no longer the war of honor dreamed of by Bushido. This was biological terrorism on its most basic level. The Japanese leadership was prepared to turn the entire island into a breeding ground for disease just to stop the enemy's advance. The bamboo Blitz was thus intended to be not only a physical assault, but a silent spread of death that would haunt American camps long after the battle ended. The spider hole tactic was a key component of the bamboo spear defense. Instead of mass charges that would be mowed down by machine guns, civilians were taught to hide in small individual pits covered with vegetation. The plan was to let the American tanks and infantry pass by and then leap from the earth to strike from behind. With a bamboo spear in hand, a single peasant could surprise a soldier, stab him, and vanish back into a tunnel system before others could react.
These holes were everywhere, in rice paddies, along roads, and even within the ruins of burnt-out houses. For an American infantryman, every step on Japanese soil was a walk through a minefield of human will. You didn't know if the ground beneath your feet would explode in the form of a fanatical old man with a sharpened stick. This paranoia eroded the psyche of soldiers faster than anything else. The spider hole became a metaphor for all of Japan in 1945, invisible, lethal, and ready for sacrifice. The bamboo spear emerged from the darkness of the earth as a reminder that in this war there were no safe zones, and every foot of captured territory was actually a trap.
As news of the Japanese civilian mobilization reached American troops in the Pacific, morale began to plummet. Soldiers who had survived the horrors of Okinawa and Iwo Jima knew the reality of Japanese fanaticism, but the idea of slaughtering women and children armed with spears was too much even for the most battle-hardened Marines. A fear known as the Spear War spread among the troops. They asked themselves, "How do I shoot an old woman running at me?" Yet they knew that if they didn't, that spear would end up in their chest. This moral paradox was exactly what Tokyo intended. The Japanese wanted to turn American liberators into mass killers of civilians, hoping that the American public at home, horrified by news of the massacres, would force the government into a negotiated peace. American soldiers wrote letters home expressing pure dread for the coming invasion. They weren't just afraid of dying, they were afraid of what they would have to become in order to survive. The bamboo Blitz was a psychological scalpel cutting at the very core of Western warfare, turning the future battlefield into a senseless slaughterhouse where victory carried the taste of eternal shame. Desperation led to unbelievable ideas, including attempts to use bamboo spears as anti-aircraft weapons. Japanese manuals suggested that masses of civilians, if they raised their spears in a synchronized fashion toward low-flying American fighters, could cause engine damage or force pilots to higher altitudes. While technically almost impossible, the mere fact that such instructions existed speaks to a total loss of touch with reality. People were encouraged to throw spears at planes during strafing runs. This wasn't a weapon. It was collective therapy for a nation that had nothing else. Every peasant with a spear pointed at the sky felt they were participating in the defense of the divine Japan. For American pilots, these scenes from the ground looked like something from another century, thousands of people waving wooden sticks at the most modern machines of the era. It was a visual representation of a total war where the line between bravery and madness was completely lost. Bamboo against aluminum, spear against machine gun, it was a clash of worlds that no longer spoke the same language. The bamboo Blitz was fueled not just by fear, but by total starvation. By the summer of 1944, the Japanese food distribution system had completely collapsed. The average civilian survived on less than 1,000 calories a day. Ironically, while people were too weak to stand, they were forced to practice with spears for hours. The energy that should have gone towards survival was wasted on preparing for death. The Japanese leadership believed that hunger would only increase the people's rage against the American devils. There were plans to use bamboo even as a cooking vessel for the few grains of rice left on the battlefield. In those final months, bamboo was everything: a weapon, a tool, and a symbol of survival. People sharpened their spears while their hands shook from protein deficiency. This image of a starving nation armed with sticks is the most accurate depiction of the Ketsu-Go strategy. It was a war that devoured its own children before the enemy ever arrived. The iron will of the empire tried to replace food with fanaticism, and the bamboo spear was the only item in abundance in a land that was dying of hunger. The beaches of Kyushu were turned into massive graveyards ahead of time. Japanese engineers, with the help of the local population, planted millions of bamboo spikes in the shallows, hoping to puncture the rubber boats in the feet of American soldiers. Behind these obstacles, in the dunes, close-quarter squads waited. Their task was simple: wait for an American to stumble or exit a boat, then run him through with a spear. There was no room for retreat here. Every defensive position was designed as a place to die. The Japanese called the beaches the gates of heaven, believing that defending these sands would secure their place in eternity. Imagine thousands of people lying in the sand, clutching their spears, listening to the roar of hundreds of ships approaching. The silence before the invasion was filled with the sound of wood being sharpened. For Japan, the beach was not a line of defense. It was a sacrificial altar. Every meter of the shore was saturated with the promise of death, and bamboo was the tool with which that promise would be fulfilled. Many historians still wonder today, did the Japanese leadership truly believe that bamboo spears could stop the Americans? The answer is likely no. The secret of the Ketsu-Go plan was not military victory, but a victory of the spirit. The generals believed that if the entire nation fought until the last breath, even defeat would be a triumph of Japanese culture over Western materialism. They believed that the bloody stain the invasion would leave on the American conscience would be so deep that Japan, even if occupied, would remain unconquered in spirit. The bamboo spear was the perfect weapon for this kind of metaphysical war. It represented Japanese soil, Japanese simplicity, and the Japanese readiness to suffer. Even when they knew the atomic bombs were on the way, commanders insisted on spear training. To them, giving up the spear meant giving up the very essence of Japan. It was a terrifying gamble with human lives, where an entire civilization was ready to vanish in flames to prove a point about its invulnerability in defeat. In the weeks before August 1945, Japan was a country that had stopped breathing. Every night, millions of people sat in the dark, clutching their bamboo spears, listening for sounds from the sea. Every rustle of a wave, every shadow on the horizon could be the beginning of the end. It was a time of collective vigil. People said goodbye to their families, burned ancestral photos, and prepared for a morning that would never come. The invasion was an inevitable reality in their minds. They didn't know about the Manhattan Project. They didn't know about Hiroshima. They only knew their spear and their oath. This atmosphere of silent, dark determination was the peak of the bamboo Blitz. It was the moment when the myth of invincibility became a self-fulfilling prophecy of death. Japan's night watch was the watch of a nation that was already dead in its mind, armed with wood against a future it couldn't imagine. This was the silence before history would take a completely different, atomic direction, leaving millions of spears to rot in the dust, unused but standing as witnesses to one of the darkest intentions in human history. On August 6, 1945, the bamboo Blitz met the atomic age. In a single blinding flash over Hiroshima, the entire logic of the Ketsu-Go strategy evaporated. The Japanese leadership had prepared for a war of attrition, a battle of centimeters fought with spears and human spirit. They were ready to sacrifice millions in a glorious, bloody struggle on the beaches, but the atomic bomb changed the rules of the game. It was a weapon that could destroy a nation without ever sending a single soldier to face a bamboo spear. As the news of the total destruction of Hiroshima and then Nagasaki reached the local defense corps, a surreal silence fell. The civilians who had spent months roistering their sticks and practicing their thrusts found themselves facing a power that made their wooden weapons look not just primitive, but tragic. The spears were still there, gripped in trembling hands, but the enemy was no longer a soldier you could stab. It was a force of nature falling from the sky. The shadow of the bomb grew longer than the reach of any spear, signaling that the honorable death might not be a heroic charge, but a silent, radioactive vanishing. On August 15, 1945, the unthinkable happened. For the first time in history, the people of Japan heard the voice of their emperor. Through the static of a radio broadcast, Hirohito announced that Japan must endure the unendurable and surrender. For the millions of volunteer corps members, this was a psychological earthquake. They had been conditioned to believe that the only end of the bamboo blitz was victory or total extinction. They were standing in their fields and schoolyards, clutching spears, ready to die, only to be told to lay them down. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Some felt a sudden, crushing sense of relief, while others felt a betrayal so deep they turned their spears upon themselves. The command to surrender was the final defeat of the wooden weapon. The bamboo blitz was over without ever having begun. The spears, once seen as sacred instruments of national salvation, were suddenly just pieces of dead wood in the hands of a defeated and starving people. When the first American occupation troops finally landed in Japan, they didn't find the demons the propaganda had promised. They found a broken, exhausted population. But as they began the process of disarmament, they were horrified by the scale of what they had nearly faced. In every village, in every school, and in every police station, they found thousands upon thousands of sharpened bamboo spears. Allied soldiers looked at these piles with a mixture of mockery and cold, shivering fear. They realized that if the invasion had proceeded, they would have had to mow down these old men and women by the millions. The mountains of wood became a chilling physical manifestation of the tragedy that was averted. These weren't high-tech weapons. They were the desperate tools of a nation that had been ready to commit collective suicide. For the American GIs, the sight of these spears was proof that the atomic bomb, as terrible as it was, had perhaps prevented a far more intimate and gruesome slaughter on the shores of Japan. The transition from total war to total occupation was symbolized by the destruction of the Takeyari. Under the orders of the Supreme Command for the Allied powers, the spears were gathered and destroyed. In a final irony, the weapons that were supposed to save Japan from the foreign devils were often used as fuel to heat the water for the occupying army or to cook the meager rations of the survivors. The spear had lost its soul. Watching their weapons burn was a final, public humiliation for many Japanese. It was the physical erasure of the Ketsu-Go ideology. The fire consumed the wood, but it also signaled the end of the cult of death. As the smoke cleared, the people were left with nothing but the task of rebuilding a nation from the ashes. The bamboo blitz had been a dream of fire and blood. Now it was just ash and soot, a dark memory of a time when the world had gone mad. For the generation that had been trained in the bamboo blitz, the end of the war brought a complex and heavy shame. Many women and former students could never look at a bamboo grove again without remembering the hours they spent oystering spears to kill children their own age. They lived with the knowledge that they had been prepared to become monsters. The spirit they had been told was their greatest strength was now seen as a dangerous delusion that nearly led to their extinction. This psychological scar ran deep through post-war Japanese society. There was a collective forgetting, a period where the story of the bamboo spears was suppressed, hidden behind the push for economic recovery and modernization. But in the privacy of their homes, many kept a single sharpened stick hidden away, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of the edge of the abyss they had walked along. The spear remained a silent witness to the fragility of reason in the face of fanatical propaganda. In the desperate years following the surrender, the materials of the bamboo blitz were repurposed for life. The wooden poles were used to prop up makeshift shacks. The metal from the few available spearheads was melted down to make needles or small tools. This was the ultimate subversion of the Ketsu-Go plan. The tools of death were literally beaten into plowshares. It was a testament to the resilience of the Japanese people, who took the remnants of their national madness and used them to survive the peace. The bamboo blitz had failed as a military strategy, but its physical remains helped build the foundation of a new, pacifist Japan. The transition was brutal and filled with hunger, but every spear that was turned into a garden tool was a victory of life over the ideology of Gyokusai. The sharpened wood was gone, replaced by the labor of rebuilding a civilization that had almost chosen to cease existing. For the Allied soldiers who were supposed to be the targets of the spears, the occupation was a period of profound relief. Every time an American GI saw a pile of bamboo spears, he thought of his own life, his family back home, and the bullet he didn't have to fire. The bamboo Blitz had been a terrifying ghost that haunted the dreams of every man in the invasion fleet. Now, seeing the spears used as fences or firewood, they realized how close they had come to a horror that would have stained their souls forever. The respect they felt for the Japanese tenacity was tempered by a deep horror at the madness of the leadership. The spears became a common souvenir. GIs would send the smaller ones home to show their parents the weapons of the enemy. But for those who understood the true intent behind the wood, these souvenirs were chilling reminders that the war had ended just in time to save both the victors and the vanished from a massacre without end.
Today, the bamboo spear is a rare artifact in Japanese museums, often tucked away in quiet corners of local history halls. It is a difficult object to categorize. Is it a symbol of courage or a symbol of a nation's descent into a death cult? In modern Japan, the Takeyari is often used in political metaphors to describe a futile or desperate effort against overwhelming odds. But the true memory of the bamboo Blitz is one of warning. It serves as a stark reminder of what happens when a government convinces its people that their lives are secondary to the state's pride. The spear is a primitive bridge between the samurai past and the atomic future, a relic of a time when a nation tried to fight the 20th century with the weapons of the 13th. It stands as a silent sentinel against the return of fanaticism, reminding us that the most dangerous weapon in any war is not the spear itself, but the mind that believes it is honorable to die for a lie.
The bamboo Blitz remains the greatest what-if of World War II. Had the atomic bombs not been dropped, and had the invasion of Japan proceeded, the history of the 20th century would be written in blood on a scale we can barely imagine. We would be talking about tens of millions of deaths. We would be talking about a Japan that was not a global economic power, but a scarred, depopulated wasteland. The bamboo spear would have been the primary instrument of that tragedy. It would have forced a generation of young Western men to become executioners of grandmothers and children. The world was spared this nightmare by a hair's breadth. The bamboo Blitz was a plan for the end of the world, a total eclipse of human reason. As we look back at the sharpened wood and the spider holes, we must recognize that the victory in 1945 was not just a military one. It was a victory for the survival of the Japanese people against their own desperate leaders. In the end, the bamboo forest returned to what it was, a part of nature, silent and indifferent to the wars of men. The bamboo Blitz was a fleeting moment of human madness, a time when the natural world was weaponized in the service of a dying empire. The sharpened sticks are gone, but the lesson remains. True strength is not found in the willingness to die for a cause, but in the courage to live and rebuild when all is lost. Japan did not survive because of the Takeyari. It survived because it finally let them go. As the wind whistles through the bamboo groves of Kyushu and Honshu, it no longer carries the sound of oystering wood or the chants of suicidal training. It carries the breath of a nation that chose life over a glorious death. The bamboo Blitz is a ghost of the past, a wooden shadow in the light of the modern world, reminding us that even in the darkest hours of desperation, the human spirit is meant for more than just a sharpened stick and a final, futile joust with destiny.